Hello and welcome to Chewing the Cud Season 1 Episode 12. My name's Andrew Jones and with me as usual is Neil Greggor.
Good morning, it's Neil.
Neil.
It's really great to be back and we've got some really interesting things to chat about today. I think we're going to enjoy it.
Yeah, I think we will. I will say last time when we recorded, we said, hey, it's going to be, when it comes out in May, our last one with Sarah, it'll be middle of silage season. Time it came out in middle of May, it wasn't middle of silage season, was it? So whoops. Obviously, but people have been going for it recently. But apart from you snatch and grabs early on, May's been a bit of a wipeout stuff. Anyway, that's the joys of recording them all together.
That's right.
Today, our guest is Dr Laura Tennant, and she is Young Animal Feeds Technical Manager. I think I've got that right.
Yeah, sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, but thanks for having me. It's really good to be here.
It is a bit of a mouthful. I wasn't expecting to say that when I said, what is your title?
I really want to make it shorter, but unfortunately Trouw GB don't act like that. So I'm just a calf person at Trouw. There you go.
Yeah, well, that's what you say. Laura is with Trouw Nutrition, and she's here to talk to us about milk powders today. But before we get on to that, Laura, as usual, what's your background? Where did you start and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so let me start at the beginning. So I grew up in Harrogate, North Yorkshire.
Nice part of the world.
Yeah, Yorkshire's the best county in England. I won't have anyone tell me any different. I left when I was 18 though, and I'm now maybe 34, but we'll leave it there. I've not been back yet, but my studies and travels have kept me away, but I do go home quite a bit still. So, so I grew up farming family, but beef and sheeps. I started milking in summer holidays and helping out friends and just anyone that needed milking help. And I absolutely fell in love with the dairy cow. What they can achieve is amazing, and it's not celebrated enough. And I just loved it. And I went to uni in Bristol. I did animal science, and I loved it. Did loads of relief milking. Made quite a bit of money actually. Thought perhaps I could do a career in it, but I decided instead to go to science. So my dissertation for my first degree was in metritis and endometritis in dairy cows. I was really interested in what the effects were on cows and how we could see it spread. From there, I decided in my infinite wisdom I wanted to be a human scientist because I thought I could get more money for it. So I went and did a master's degree in London looking at human reproductive health and fertility. But animals are never far away. My thesis in my master's was looking at the effects of diet on steroid biochemistry hormones in sheep. So we used sheep as a model for polycystic ovary syndrome in women, but we could also map that certain essential oils in diets of sheep affected hormone production.
Wow.
Including
steroid biochemistry. So I thought, okay, I think sheep's going to be sheep's going to be my thing. So
sorry, I was going to say that does tie in because I've heard. Do you know Brian Vernon at all? Dr. Brian Vernon. I've heard him talk in the past, and he said, like you're saying about that, like the role of omega-3 and omega-6. And he said, they were doing something with cows, and then they got linked in with. Was it London Zoo or something in the mid-70s or something like that? And he said it doesn't seem to matter what animal. And then they got talking to somebody in human. Right. I know I'm sort of sorry.
No, it's good.
And how it doesn't matter what the animal seems to be. It's those omega-3s and omega-6s. The ratios are standard pretty much across every species. And what a difference it makes on reproductive.
That's what fascinated me, is that diet can have this massive interaction. And I think we are really aware in animals that the effect of diet on health and reproduction is quite clear. We don't seem to put that across to humans, which I find quite interesting.
Didn't I read recently, they are starting to find that, aren't they, that is with the epigenetics, that what your mother... No. Your mother's fertility is affected by what their mother ate or something like that, and is still affecting you sort of 2 generations later. And we
certainly know this in dairy cows and dairy calves for sure.
Right.
But that pull to animals was always there, and But I was living in London and I absolutely loved it at the time. I was working in a cocktail bar and I thought I'm going to get a job in London. So I worked for the National Institute for Medical, I can't remember its full title. It was a research place, and I did research for 2 years after my master's, and I loved it. But I got to the end of my stint in London and I was tired and I was pretty broke, and I thought, right, okay, I'm going to do this PhD now, and I really want to focus on farm animal health, reproduction and dietary interventions. So incoming Phil Garnsworthy at Nottingham University, I went to see him a couple of times. We had a chat and he said, I think I've got a project for you. So I applied and I got in. So I went from Bristol to London and back up to Nottingham, so on the way to Yorkshire. So I thought. And then, I spent 3-4 years doing a PhD with Phil Garnsworthy, had an amazing time, lots of studies, met some amazing people. I also started working on the university dairy farm during my PhD, so I was a general farm labourer. Not done a lot of work with calves at this point.
So what was your PhD, or are we?
So my PhD was in rumen function. I did a little bit on pre-ruminant function, but it's generally on rumen function. What I was really interested in is what effects we could implement in cows, whether that be dietary changes, whether that be situation changes, what effect that had on cortisol levels in the animal, and then what effect that had in rumen function. So what I was trying to show was, and I did this some successfully and not in others. By success, I mean, sexy science means I come out and say, you can't do this, otherwise you'll get this. A lot of my science was proving kind of already what we knew, just in different situations. But that was great as well. One of the best studies that I looked at in my PhD was looking at dry cows. So looking at how when dry cows, which I think are massively underrated on lots of farms, they are the true queens in my opinion. You need to get the dry period right. Any stress that was inflicted on those animals at that time, so I mean stress as in animal movement, dietary changes, because they do not have the blood pumping around the system, because they're not milking, they find cortisol a lot harder to shift. So any stress that they feel will stay around a lot longer. And that really kind of prepped me for going out into the world of farms and farming with Trouw, and I'll explain that in a second, was really, in order to get the best quality young stock, we need to really make sure we're looking after that dry period.
Yep.
But anyway, back to Nottingham. So I started working for the farm, absolutely loved it, got a little bit involved in the young stock, and I thought, okay, I'll give this a go. I then was Head of Youngstock at the University of Nottingham for just under 3 years. Yep. Loved it, absolutely loved it. But unfortunately, Trouw could pay me a little bit more. And as much as I loved rearing someone else's calves, it's difficult when they're not your own. You don't have all the decisions. Working for Trouw has been amazing. I've kept quite a close relationship with Nottingham, so that's been great as well.
How long have you been Trouw? 3 years?
4.5.
4 that long now?
Oh, stop showing my age.
You're showing your age. How do you think
I'm going to stop trying.
So I joined Trouw as a ruminant technical advisor, actually. So I did a lot of mineral specs, mineral formulations, did a lot on the ruminant side. But I just didn't have the passion for it that I did for young stock. When you've reared lots of babies, you have a different interest. I was really lucky to work with my manager, Georgina Thomas, who helped me kind of explore that further. And now I work as a YAF technical advisor, if you like. And part of my role is to help our customers. So Trouw is business to business. So our customers are people like Trevor Birchall Agriculture, Winstay, companies like that. And we help them with products.
You have to mention a competition.
Sorry, I was just thinking in the southwest, like.
No, I know. Or Cars Billington, or
Cars Billington, or
any of them.
Exactly. Harborough. Let's go north.
As many as you can get.
So, but remember, there are only 2 British milk powder houses in the UK. That's Trouw and Volac. So the milk powder game is interesting, but there's only 2 producers in the UK. That's interesting as well. Lots of different milk powders come into the UK. But there's only 2 houses that make them. So.
Oh, right.
So obviously you've been with Trouw now, as we say, for 4.5 years.
I'm completely Trowed, I would say. I apologise for this now.
So we're here to talk about milk powders.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard you mention her, Georgina, speak a couple of times and give presentations about milk powders.
Yeah.
I mean, I can be honest about it. Trouw came out with the Energizer powder.
2018?
was it that long ago? I was going to say 5 years ago now. And I'm a big fan of it. I'll say that. I guess we've got that card on the table now. It used to be, for me, people would go, which milk powder do I use? And it was like, well, how long
This is the biggest question.
There are just so many different ones out there. Whether you use whey, whether you use skim, proteins, we can talk about all of those things. But as soon as I saw Energizer, this is not an advert for Trouw or Energizer.
But I'm quite enjoying it though.
But it didn't matter what the calf was. There was Jersey, crossbred, Holstein, spring calving, autumn calving, year-round calving. Those calves just look fantastic. So for me personally, if anyone ever says to me, what milk powder do I use? My first port of call is go to Energizer. And
I've just slipped him a tenner across the table. No, I don't know if you can hear that. No, I'm joking.
I've got it.
I am joking, but I think it's interesting. The Energizer concept is quite interesting, and I think it's interesting because it was one of the first powders that tried to model whole milk as its design, and that in itself is quite tricky. And what we found is when calves drink energised calf milk, because it acts like whole milk in the abomasum, they digest it really well.
It is the calves. I've only ever seen calves. The only time The only time I've seen calves potentially look better is when they've been on whole milk. No doubt about it.
Agreed. There's no better substrate for a calf. Whole milk is number one. So all we try and do is model.
Yeah, I've never seen anything look better than unless it's on whole milk than on the Energizer. So say unless somebody, then the objection is the cost, because let's be honest, it's not cheap. There are more expensive ones out there, but it is at the top end.
Oh yeah.
Unless someone's got an objection, then we look at something else. But if you said to me, pick a milk powder, I'd quite happily put my flag and go Energizer. That's my first choice, because the results I've seen time and time and time again, and the positive feedback I get time and time and time again, is it mixes well, the calves do well, the calves are healthier, all of these things. So, but what should, taking a step back then, what should we be looking for in a good milk powder? What shouldn't we be doing? Why has Energizer come about? What's the research behind it? What other things should we look for in milk? Because I've got to be honest with you, I've been on a farm once that said, we don't feed any palm in our milk powder. And I remember coming up to probably Georgina at the time and she went, well, you can't do that. And I know there is now a palm-free one out there. But this person was adamant they were feeding palm-free because they were being supplied by someone. Said, no, we're feeding palm-free. And every milk powder's got palm in. I now know the reason why, and there's a good reason for it.
So that was a lot of questions. I'm going to try and answer them all, but let's start with why I would recommend a powder. So when we think about a calf milk replacer, what we need the calf to be able to do is digest it. Yeah. And that sounds really simple. That sounds like, every milk powder out there must be thinking about digestibility of calves. Unfortunately, this is not the case. And you know this when it comes to compound tickets. You know this when it comes to formulations. Not all of potentially the ingredients are going to be focused on the initial goal. So for us, it's digestibility.
Well, sorry, that's the initial one as well. Think of digestibility. The one big misnomer with calf milk powder is soya. People go, let's put think because it's got soya in there, because it must be good. Whereas for calves, the digestibility of soya is atrocious.
And the reason why digestibility of soya is really bad is because it's all to do with the carbon chain length. So an abomasum, that's a true stomach of the cow, so we've got to look after it in babies. And what happens is if the carbon chain length is too long, so the fatty acid structure is too long, calves can't digest it. If it's too short, calves can't digest it, because the abomasum has one job for a calf, and what's that job? To digest milk replacer. Not to take any solid feed, not even to take water. They go into the rumen. So we've got to look after that gut. And what we do is we think, we'll put a bit of soya in there, I'll put a bit of rapeseed oil in there, because the farmer will look at the ticket and he'll say, well, my cows eat that, it must be good. But what we must remember is cows and calves are completely different. They are completely different animals.
Still effectively monogastric, isn't it?
Exactly. And they're like 50% water versus a cow, which is like 20%. They're completely different animals. So digestibility for me is super important. Yeah. Is that always available on the label of the milk replacer? Not always. We must always talk to our reps about what we're trying to feed our calves. So going back to your initial question, how do you pick a milk replacer? I think you've got to be asking questions around dairy products and dairy protein. These need to be digestible.
Okay, so the basics start with then, skim or whey?
Right, so
Difference.
I am completely a skim girl. I have been for a very long time because I believe, and this isn't the belief of Trouw or anyone else in this room, this is my belief, calves should drink skim. That's what they're designed to drink. Now, what's the difference between skim and whey? That was the second question. So when you take milk from a cow, we take off the fat. We're left with the skim milk powder, so the fat will be used, the butter cream, if you like, will be used for stuff. We use the skim milk powder. That's dried off, and you've got a skim powder that's used in milk replacers. Whey is the byproduct of the cheese industry. So that is a dairy product, so very good, but it takes a few more steps to get to a crystallized product that we can put into milk replacers. Now, the difference between how they're digested is the key. So when skim goes down the esophagus into the abomasum of the calf, it forms an abomasal clot. Now, I don't work in marketing, but I like to call it an energy bullet. Sorry about that. It takes about 3 to 4 hours for the calf to digest that energy bullet, the abomasal clot. When whey is digested by the calf, so down the esophagus into the abomasum, it's digested really quickly at the top of the digestive tract in about 20 minutes.
Right.
Do whey and skim milk replacers grow calves equally? Yes. Do they have different modes of actions? Yes. So when people say to me, what should I feed, skim or whey? The first question I ask is, what do you prefer? What do you think you prefer to feed? Because calf rearers, myself included, we're pretty emotive. We want it to smell nice, want it to look nice, want the calves to do all right. So if I try and put a skim milk replacer onto a farm that has used whey, I think I'm going to have problems, because I think they're going to say the poo looks different, it smells different. You've got to work with where people want to be. You've also got to ask the question around how they're rearing these calves. Yeah. How often are they feeding? If they're feeding once a day, which I do not condone ever.
And you can't do under 28 days.
And you can't do under 28 days. If you're going to feed a whey powder, those calves are going to be pretty hungry. They're going to be pretty hungry because it's digested in about 20 minutes.
Yeah. So what you're saying is it's what's the word? The whey is, as you say, it's digested very quickly, so they're getting an instant, almost not sugar rush, but they're getting that hit, bang, it's done. Whereas the skim will take longer.
Slower release.
Fuller for longer.
They'll feel fuller for longer. But yeah, it's the digestive routes that are different, and that's why my professional head, I say, it doesn't matter what you feed, skim or whey, you've just got to understand how they're digested. My personal head, I would only feed a skim.
Yeah, sounds like the calf would be very happy with that too. Because if they're feeding full,
well, I think they would be very happy with that, which is why I don't condone once a day feeding. But if I do work with producers that try and wean calves off on once a day, skim's a little bit nicer for them. Yeah. And we all know that calves, because they are monogastric, they're neonatal, don't ever forget the stress that might be imposed on that calf if they can't perform natural behaviours. So what is a natural behaviour for a calf? To drink ad lib, warm, skim, whenever they want, well, full fat, whenever they want. And we take them and we say, we're going to feed you twice a day. And it's going to be a whey, and it's only going to last 20 minutes. Yeah. And that's where I think we need to just think about the system. There's no right or wrong answer. With milks, it's about assessing everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, unfortunately, for you and your listeners, I'm only a skim-based girl.
Thanks. Well, as long as there's something that makes sense about it, we're happy.
Exactly. So then one of my other questions, I would say, I've mentioned soya, the fact that it is undigestible. And let's be honest, there are milk powders out there that are high protein, so 26%, and usually that's because they put things like soya in there, but because it looks good to people that feed cows. Oh, soya.
Exactly. Anything like soya oil, linseed on a label you associate with cows, and what we must remember is it's not very digestible to a calf. Right. They can digest it by about week 5, week 6, but last time I checked, you've done most of your milk feeding by week 5, week 6. So we've got to be careful. And I think for me, I just ask reps questions. The people that you selling your milk replacer, ask them questions. There's plenty of context out in the industry now where people are asking, what's the dairy protein in here, what's the dairy percentage in here. We don't always put stuff on labels. Got to be careful, there's a lot of competition at milk replacers, isn't there? And thinking back to a question you mentioned at the beginning, palm free milk replacers. This is really interesting. It's really interesting because the reason why we use palm and coconut in milk replacers is because it replicates the fatty acid structure of whole milk in the gut of the calf.
Wow.
That's why we do it. Are we going to be able to use palm forever? I don't think so. But is the answer just taking palm out now and using coconut? Absolutely not. We've no idea how that actually acts in the abomasum. So I totally agree with the industry. Totally agree that palm is not here forever. But the answer is not to just take it out and go, here, we've got a palm-free solution.
No, that's what we were talking about earlier. You can't just do something and expect it to work.
No. And we've got to be so careful with calves because, you know, digestibility, if you've got a powder that's not digestible, there's only 2 ways a calf can communicate to you there's a problem. They either don't drink the milk, reduce intake, or they have, what's the correct word? Scour. I was going to say something else then. They scour him. So there's two communication tools. And then that scour, you think to yourself, well, what's causing that scour? Is it digestibility? Is it stress? Is it because we're not feeding enough? Is it because we're feeding too much at a different sort of day? There's lots of different reasons, and we've got to try and reduce the risk because calves only have 2 ways to communicate.
Well, yeah, and calves like consistency.
Oh, they love it. They love consistency because.
I still remember a story that I was told when I went to Covington by the farm manager. Someone asked him how to rear a calf once, and he said, "Oh, you did. I can't remember what. You know, it was like 2 scoops of this to 1 scoop of this, or whatever it was. So like a scoop of milk powder to 2 scoops of water. So I can't remember exactly what it was." And he said, I saw...
Always follow manufacturer's guidelines, by the way, listeners.
Yeah. Anyway, so he saw the woman 6-8 weeks later and saw the calf. And he said it was this monster great calf. Monster. But what it is she put the ratio, she put it the wrong way round. So it was 2 scoops of milk powder to 1 scoop of water, or whatever it was. So more than double what it should be. But the point was it was consistency, and because it was consistently getting the same, it hadn't had any negative effects other than, I suppose, improved solids, improved growth rates.
Yeah, and that's a nice story, and it certainly I agree with the consistency on calves. What I don't agree with, what you just said, is that increasing powder for increasing solids. I don't agree with that. There's lots of nice papers out.
That's what happened in that
there's lots of nice papers out now showing that we really must control the solid with regards to being mixed in a litre, because we're really hyper focused now on something called osmolality in the gut. Osmolality in the gut is, in the simplest terms, is like the pressure within the gut. If you've got too many salts and sugars, that's effectively what a milk replacer is. It can tip off the balance, and that balance is something called hypertonemia, which can increase the risk of scour.
For anybody listening to this, just try and remember your osmosis from GCSE. Or for some of us, no, I wasn't. I was GCSE. Older listeners, O-level biology, and see if you can remember all of that, because that was always one of the things that was like, oh.
Basically, we need to always stick to manufacturers' guidelines on the back of the packet of milk replacer. It will tell you how many grams you can put in a litre. Certainly at Trouw, we're really focused on this because of osmotic pressure in the gut.
Do you know what? Actually, it reminds me. Yeah, I do know farms. You go on, how much do you feed? Oh, well, we just feed a jug. Do you know how much is in the jug? No, but usually a jug does whatever. Okay, that might have been when you weighed it for like 3 milk powders ago, or whatever's changed in that time. You should just make sure if you're using a new milk powder, that your measurements are correct.
So I have the absolute privilege of travelling the country, going onto farms, and you won't be able to see this, listeners, but I'm not very good at hiding my face. So when I get onto a farm and they say, "This is the jug," and I'm like, consistency exists within times of feeding, it consists within hygiene around cows, but it also means having the same amount of powder to liquid ratio for every feed. It's really, really important. Stick to manufacturers' guidelines, guys. It's really important.
Yeah.
And if you want to feed more, if you're worried about them being cold or you're worried about heat stress, feed more litres rather than grams of powder. This is important as well.
Well, that's a good one. I was just thinking that question. So where are you in terms of litres fed? I know you've had a bit of a bashing on this one.
Oh, no, you're not going here, are you?
Well, I don't disagree with you, if I'm honest. But it's just the fact that give you the opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah, so I believe that you can feed your calves as much as you can afford to feed, as much as you want to feed. There is no top limit. Calves are really good. We don't believe it, but they're really good at regulating intake. So if you allow calves to drink ad lib, I've spent quite a bit of time in Germany, they ad lib feed their calves, and their calves each individual calf will stop at a certain literage because they feed for energy requirements, so they drink enough to satisfy their energy needs. So we know calves at foot will drink 10 to 15 litres. They'll be able to get it whenever they want. We restrict calves because we think that calves might get sick. There's lots of we thinks. So I'm on the camp that calves if you have the right milk replacer, whole milk, or one that's balanced, can drink as much as they want. It's all about managing the feed curve on the way down. Don't worry about calves on the way up, as in when you start feeding them, feed at whatever you can. So I think minimum for me is 8 litres.
Yeah.
On the way down is where it's key. So when a calf is at the foot of a dam, how long does she drink milk for?
Don't know. How long?
I thought for 20 minutes time.
Six months.
Sorry.
Months? Yeah. How long was she?
How long?
How?
She,
Yeah.
Sorry.
When
Yeah.
did she wean herself?
Yeah, 6 to 8 months. Whenever the dam kicks her off, it'll be slow rumen development.
Yeah.
What we do is we say, right, you've got 8 weeks. Go. And the calf goes.
Absolutely. We do.
The calf goes, okay, I can only grow on milk. Actually, milk is my best growth substrate. And I only want to drink milk. I'm so milk focused. Oh no, now you've taken the milk away and I've got to eat this cake, but I've only had a week to do it. The wean down is super important. You've got to allow them to develop
that makes sense. Yeah.
a taste for the compound. You've also got to allow the rumen microbiota to be able to digest it. And how long does that take in dairy cows of established rumens? 2 weeks. 10 to 2. So a minimum of 2 week weaning is super important. So in that lesson, you can feed as much milk as you want. It's about the feed curve.
That's some of the argument against feeding more liquid.
Yeah.
And I know I came up against this when I first started selling Energizer.
Yeah.
When it was, because the recommendation was like up to 8. And let's be honest, we all know there are still some people who only feed 4 litres.
Oh, 65% in a recent Trouw study only feed 6 litres.
By feeding more milk or milk powder, they will eat less solids, and therefore they'll be slower developing the rumen, etc., and go on. But it's pretty switch. I know you guys have done it, and or as in Trouw, and met one of your former colleagues. I suspect the other day. Is it Ginny?
Oh, did he show it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, an AHDB meeting I went to. But it is, the research is there that at this stage, when they're effectively monogastrics,
They are.
the best, because that was a talk about getting animals through to second lactation, to grow them, the most efficient time to grow these calves is basically before they develop that rumen.
They're the most feed efficient they'll ever be through the other mason and milk.
Really, if you're going to spend money to make them grow,
you've got to spend it there.
Then, not when they're 18 months and you suddenly, or 12 months and you've suddenly got to get them up to the rate at 15 months. That's inefficient. You need to grow them.
Remember, in the
first month or two as much as you can.
Remember, in the first 50 days of life, you get the most organ development that animal will ever have. You're making the lungs, the heart. Last time I checked, we need these for a dairy cow but it's dairy cow or beef animal, right? So you've got to hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Also, remember, in the first 2 weeks of life, you're building the immune system of the calf. So for the first 10 days of life, the colostrum, which hopefully someone's lovingly put in, or the mum or the dam's put in, covers the calf for about 9 to 10 days.
And we should say that's important, isn't it? First 6 hours to get colostrum.
Oh, yeah, so very important.
How many litres of colostrum would you ideally do?
So if you're not testing 4 litres, and by testing I mean with a Brix refractometer, you need a score of 22 and above. You can get away with maybe 3.5 litres. If you're not testing, you need to try and put more in there because you've only got one shot. Yeah. The gut lining of the calf closes to immunoglobulins, so that's what's in.
That's what people don't realise. That's what it is. That first 6 hours is the gut is can absorb longer chain molecules.
It's immunoglobulins. It's big enough for those proteins to get through to build the immunity. Now you've got
past 6 hours that closes. You can't get it.
24 hours it's shut completely.
Yeah.
Remember, the udder of the cow also has a little timer on it as well. She can't hold really good colostrum for that long, so you got to get it off her quick and get it into the calf quick. I imagine when I teach it that there's a little timer above the calf's head and above the cow's head, like this is how long you got before it starts to fail.
So if you do test it, how long? Because you're saying 4 litres if you don't test it. If you do test it,
that's really rough. But if you test it and you know the score, you can get away with feeding perhaps 3 to 3.5 litres. 3 litres is generally 10% of body weight for a calf, isn't it? Yeah. I tend to implement 4 litres. People get a bit upset by that because I also like people to tube colostrum. People get really upset by that.
I used to do that. I mean, some people don't like it, but I just used to find...
You've got one shot. You've got one shot to get that colostrum in.
If the calf had sucked, just to double check everything, I just used to bag everything.
You've got one shot to get this right. There's no other time it can be replicated. Transition milk, in essence, so I only class colostrum as the first milking from the cow, because by the time the second milking comes, that immunoglobulins is down. That's transition milk. We know there's loads of really good things in transition milk, hormones, fats, but the first milking, maybe the second, depending on how you do it, is the colostrum. So you've got to get it in the calf. You've got one shot. So this step has to be right. And I know, and you'll all know, and all your listeners will know, that sickly calves always comes back to the beginning, and no milk powder, no feed additive, no veterinary product is going to help you if you don't get the first step right. If they haven't had that
colostrum, you've got no chance.
Well, one thing that just catches, of course we've just spoken about this, but you were saying about 8 litres instead of 6 or instead of 4, and then we were speaking about how vitally important it is for the weaning. So if you've given 8 litres and you've actually got through to the weaning, that's going to make your life a lot easier because you've done it properly. If you're giving 6, then I presume it would actually take longer and you'd have more problems.
Well, they're just not quite getting the energy values into them. And I think when you think about how much a calf can drink from mum and then how much we give them, and there's many reasons for that, isn't there? There's money, economics, all the rest of it. But if a calf had a choice, they would have ad lib. So when you feed 6 litres, that calf has a lot to do with that energy. So it's growing organs the first 50 days, it's growing an immune system, and it's also developing sight, because they can run around, you forget that they've got a lot of work to do. So then in the first 2 weeks, I want to coin the term feed for immunity. I want to forget everything else, because the crossover of immunity happens at about day 10. So mum's colostrum, if we've done it right, if we've tubed that 4 litres in, on day 9, you'll start to see a crossover. Now, how a calf builds immunity is from energy from milk. It doesn't have any other energy substrate because it can't eat concentrate. So if you only feed 4 to 6 litres in that time, the only thing you're affecting is immunity. The buggers will still grow, you know, because they're really feed efficient. They can do a lot with not a lot. But then if you think about feeding for immunity rather than feeding for growth, you would change your life, which is why I'm a bit of a champion now for ad lib feeding in the first 3 weeks of life, because the cost will offset. We can wean them down later, but for the beginning, let them drink for energy provision.
That's what something Ginny said was the fact that cost-wise, and they said they've done the costings for it, trying to feed, I don't know, 2 kilos of concentrate at 12 months to try and get them up to weight at 15 months for serving is a hell of a lot more expensive than... Okay, it might seem expensive headline price on your milk powder than feeding enough milk powder or more milk powder at the beginning. Your most efficient time is that first month or two before that, while that rumour's developing.
And we know we can't catch up. All the organs are made in the beginning. The immunity is made at the beginning. What makes us think that we can starve them now and it'll be okay later, and perhaps they will get up to a certain weight, but what have we missed in...
But now what you guys were actually saying, I mean, the general consensus would be that people are scared of overfeeding because of scouts. We had a little bit of a discussion before. Going to that?
Yeah, so... Overfeeding is interesting. I mean, can we overfeed calves? No, they will always self-regulate, and that is something I want to get out there. Calves drink for energy demands. Now, are all milk replacers created equal? No. So if a milk replacer isn't focused on digestibility and you try and feed a lot to a calf, how she's going to tell you that it's not right is she's probably going to scour, he or she, and then she's probably going to get fussy with the milk. Always remember that calves are so ridiculously milk driven that if they don't want to drink milk, they're not being awkward, they're not trying to be a pain in the bum, there's something wrong. And this is a lesson I learned when I was rearing.
It can be, because I know certain cow families that I used to own. Some I used to call them my bovine vacuum cleaners, because you'd show them the teat once and bang, it was gone. It was gone. Other cow families, you'd spend 10 days trying to get these damn things to sale.
See, I would argue against you. There was something wrong with that gut, and the reason why there's something wrong with that gut is that is the only food source they can have. It's survivability.
They run whole milk. But
something was wrong in the gut.
But it was always that particular cow family would always take you 10 days. Male, female, doesn't matter, because I kept bulls from the family to sell.
Maybe you were the problem.
Probably. Because I'll be honest with you, I didn't enjoy calf rearing. I didn't do too badly at it, but I didn't enjoy it. But as I say,
and there, listeners, he just said it. He didn't enjoy calf rearing.
But as I say, another cow family I had, it didn't matter. You just showed them the teat, and they were gone.
I know
I think there was a little bit of genetic element.
So some beef crossed with dairy calves are just plain stupid.
I mean, Angry Angus's are the worst, right?
They can be so stupid.
Give me a Belgian Blue Cross any day, they're a dream.
Yeah, they're used to sort of suckling. But yeah, no, sorry, carry on.
No. So this digestibility is a problem. And I think when you get scour in a calf, we don't want to see it, right? No farmer or rearer wants to see scour, so we want to stop it. So back when you were both kids, maybe.
As old as him.
we were told that if we saw scour, we needed to stop feeding milk. And the reason why we were told that was because what happens when you stop feeding milk? You stop the scour because there's no nutritional matter going through that calf. Problem is, when they can only digest milk, you're taking away the only thing that's going to make them better. So when you guys were sick, what did your mom tell you to do? Keep eating, keep drinking. Generally, you must keep eating.
We were spoiled with Lucozade.
Yeah, Lucozade, and then toast with
spoonful of cod liver oil, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah,
and unfortunately, I do remember that.
Then the notion was always to keep drinking and keep eating, because if you can't keep your energy reserves up, you're not going to get better. So, but the reason we stopped feeding milk,
keep hydrated.
The reason we stopped feeding milk is because we didn't want to see it. So in comes the birth of electrolytes into modern British agriculture. Came in about the 70s. We started pushing out a lot of electrolyte because we had a scour problem on farm. I'm not going to go into that today. There's a million reasons that scour could exist. However,
I'll say you say in the 70s, but I mean my father was, it was only early 2000s when vet told me otherwise in Victoria that I was feeding milk and electrolytes, yes, at different times. But my father was like, no, you don't, you just feed electrolytes again. I guess that's what he'd been told.
So they came out in the 70s, and they came from a blueprint from the World Health Organization. That's quite hard to say. That created an electrolyte for kids with cholera. Saved the lives of millions.
Is that what it came from?
Saved the lives of millions. Really cheap, really effective. And we modelled a lot of the electrolytes used for agricultural animals based off this specific formulation. But what we didn't think about was that calves, for example, are quite different to children. So in our intuitive ways, we took the kid electrolyte and we said, calves are a bit bigger, we're going to add a bit more of this, add a bit more of this, add a bit more of this. And the electrolyte for calf was born. Now, we know the abomasum super sensitive, right, to gut penetration, to gut problems, and we know we've got to hydrate them. And when we hydrate an animal, we've got to make sure that the molecular products in there are really correct. If not, that calf isn't going to be hydrated. So there's lots of really nice research going on the past 5 or 6 years looking at exactly what's needed in an electrolyte. Problem is, there's not a lot of money in electrolytes. It's not a massive booming business because margins are very tight. It's a feed additive. However, listeners, whatever you do when it comes to calf scour, calf dehydration, we have to replace the fluids lost, and we're going to need an electrolyte to do that. We're going to need an electrolyte to do that because water on its own wouldn't work. Now I'm going to tell you a story.
But we also need to say, make sure you keep having milk, but it's how you do it, not at the same time, etc.
We've got to keep feeding milk alongside it. Like Mum used to say to you, what do you need to do when you're sick? You need to keep eating and you need to keep drinking. This is the same for calves. If you need to bring the milk down a little bit so you can get that 2 litres of electrolyte in, you might have to do that, but as long as they're getting a couple of litres of milk a day, they'll be all right. If you take the milk away, that's often what kills them.
Just to say, I'd say I was not at the same time, is it?
You can never put electrolytes into milk. You should never do it because milk,
there should be a couple of hours difference,
about 2 to 3 hours generally. But remember that milks are lots of salts and sugars and solutes. They go into the abomasum and they create a busy environment. Good milk replacers, we've modelled it so it's a nice environment. If you add an electrolyte on top of that milk, what is an electrolyte? Salts and sugars, another busy environment. If you're adding that to the milk, what can happen is that hypertonemia, that crazy word again, the gut pressure can actually cause more scour. So what the industry hasn't been very forthcoming at talking about is how if we feed electrolytes incorrectly, i.e. not in water, they can cause the opposite effect.
So that's probably why the older generation was taught to feed electrolytes and not milk.
Yeah, maybe.
Because you were probably making such a mess, and we probably didn't know that.
No, we won't have known why we were causing the problem. But the story I was going to say was that when I was rearing, I stopped using electrolytes. I stopped using them because I thought they were an absolute waste of time. So I started using 2 litres of warm water and some Metacam, other brands available, anti-inflammatory. And I thought that did a better job. And then when I started looking into the world of electrolytes, I realised that we just got the levels wrong. We'd just not been thinking about what was needed. And we kept putting it in the milk. I put it in the milk because the back of the packet told me it could go in the milk. So I did that. Now when farmers say to me, okay then, what electrolyte would you recommend? I say, as long as they tell you not to put it in the milk, it means they have some understanding about how to hydrate a calf. So that's it. That's my advice.
As simple as that.
Yeah.
But no, actually, because I mean, what we were saying about routine and the calves liking the same thing. If you do put it in the milk, it changes the flavour. Changes.
And from experience, they don't drink it. And
if
if they reduce their intake, they're reducing the energy demands and the energy intakes. And if you're only feeding 5 litres of milk a day, that's a pretty rough day for the calf, isn't it?
And the calf sick on top of that.
And then the farmer will say, well, I haven't got uniform growth. All the calves are different weights. And I'm like, well, yeah. Because they're all getting, So we are learning a lot more about electrolytes. It'll keep coming out. But yeah, advice to everyone, don't put electrolytes into milk. Always put it into water. Feed milk alongside electrolytes with a couple of hours difference. And check the label and make sure they tell you to feed it in water. Ignore anyone that says to feed it in milk. Remember, water goes in the rumen as well. Milk goes in the abomasum. 2 different stomachs.
Thinking about going back to milk powders then, I'm just going back, I mean obviously we mentioned Energizer, sorry this is not an advert for Energizer, but I guess it's, but one thing that made Energizer different, and maybe you can answer this, is the fact that it was, usually traditional milk powders have been higher protein, lower fat. Energizer was higher fat with I'm not going to say low protein, but a lower protein than the fat. What was the science behind that?
So when milk replacers were first being made, it was just after the war, and we needed milk from the cows to feed our population, and we needed something else to feed the cows. And what we did was we used a lot of whey-based products at the time because that was the additive waste product from cheese. And because we'd fed a lot of cows, we thought that we needed real high protein because that's going to grow calves. What we've learned...
Well, let's be honest, in my lifetime, feeding cows, the protein's gone from... Was it the optimum for milk production is 22.5% crude protein, and now, you're 16 and below is the push to do and feed, amino acids or whatever it happens to be. But so just in terms of cows, that's lowered, that's changed.
And I think there was thoughts at the time that protein was going to grow these calves, and then what research came out over, calf research changes every 10 years. It's fantastic. We learn more and more and more, and what we learned was that actually calves need fat as an energy source. They need dense fat as an energy source, and this makes sense.
Well, they can't absorb starch, can they?
Well, they haven't got a rumen, and this makes sense because I'm not comparing calves to babies, but you would never rear a baby on a protein shake, would you? You'd make sure that there was enough fat in there because fat helps keep them warm. Fat helps them develop. It's really dense source of energy. But we needed digestible fat. It needs to be the right chain length. So that's why we're looking into carbon chain length, looking at the fatty acid structure. So this has all been developed over the past 20, 30 years. It's amazing how much calf rearing has changed. And I do feel for people that are rearing calves now, and they've done it for maybe 50 years, the industry must have completely changed, wholeheartedly. But Energizer was born because we believed in the message of fat as this dense source of energy. There's lots of research gone into it, lots of published papers. Trouw has a research centre over in the Netherlands that runs calf trials, many calf trials every year. We're constantly trying to test and improve. In fact, we've got improvements coming. Will keep coming, I think, because as we develop more understanding. The protein level has come down in Energizer, so it's 22.5 versus some of the others you see in industry, 25, 26. The reason why it came down was because when we looked at paper analysis, so all the published papers on protein in calves, you realise that it sits between 20 and 23 for ultimate utilisation, so digestion by the abomasum. Remember, the rumen is much more equipped to digest protein and amino acids. The abomasum isn't generally so. It's much better equipped to digest fat. And listeners, let's not forget, when we look at whole milk as a fraction, what's higher, protein or fat? It's always fat. 30% fat.
Which when you put it like that, it just makes sense. It doesn't say. You're talking about protein. I know before obviously Energizer came out, had seen a paper. It was a Chinese/Australian paper.
Nice.
And it compared milk proteins. It had high, medium and low, and they were at 18, 21 and 24% proteins, and they looked at growth rates. And I've mentioned it to several people over the years, and so which one grew best? And everyone always goes, oh, the 24. And you go, no, it was the 21. And they're like, and if you read it, and I said basically what the supposition was that 24 is too high, and they wasted energy expelling the protein that they didn't need.
Deamination of protein takes energy. If it's too much, you don't need it all. You're just gonna, what do I tell farmers? It just comes out the back.
Yeah, exactly. and at 18 it was too low. But it was the 21% proteins were the ones that grew the best. And let's be honest, it's no different feeding a dairy cow. You feed that protein too much, what's it doing? It's wasting energy, expelling it, and that's where you get that high ammonia smell as it's coming through the urine or whatever it is. It's just it's using energy, wasting energy that it could be using for production in expelling waste products.
And we don't want calves to waste energy digesting things when they need all the energy that they can get. We talked about it earlier. They've got their energy demands are through the roof. Like, let's give them something digestible and dense. And fat is demonized for many things, but fat for calves, for beef calves, for dairy calves, is the ultimate source of energy. And if you feed fat in the pre-weaning system, so when they're drinking milk, it does not mean they will become fat adults. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
It's just a dense
it's
source
quite
of
the
energy,
opposite.
isn't it?
We know through human studies that if babies are starved, maybe not on purpose, but if they're starved, they don't placate the metabolism properly, so they're more likely to become fat adults. This is the same in lots of animal studies now as well. So we've got to make sure there's fat there, we've got to make sure there's energy there, and we're training the metabolism. So that's why I believe that we should feed calves what they need. Obviously money is important, on-farm semantics are important, but if we think about what calves are expecting and how we can adapt to that, I think we can make sure we're programming metabolism, getting the growth, getting healthier, more robust animals.
Yeah, you know that it comes back to obviously my line of work is genetics. So if you
can't exploit genetic potential without training the metabolism, can you?
You can't. Now, what I've often said to farmers, I'll breed you. I'll recommend the correct bull. I'll make sure it's not inbred. I'll make sure it's feed efficient. I'll make sure all of that is right.
But you've got to feed it.
But you've got to look after it.
Yeah.
And if you raise it, then I can do that. Now, in theory, what you've just said comes back to one of our favourite, which is efficiency or sustainability, whichever word you use. Is that, in other words, I can actually have less calves that are raised properly.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make the same amount of money.
Less cost.
Less costs. So the
Less
cost
carbon.
aspect, I have a huge problem
the
with.
carbon footprint, all of these.
Yeah, the minute somebody says it's going to cost me too much, I'm thinking to myself, do it properly, and you can probably raise 7 instead of 10.
And this is where, you know, you farmers, they get very caught up on, and I do as well, I guess, is they look at powders, milk powders, and they say, well, that one's £200 a tonne more expensive, I'm not going to go there.
Yeah.
I'm like, but if it gets them where they need to be 2 weeks quicker, or then...
Another example of that sometimes, though, is people don't, in terms of headline price, I've sat down and done it for a client. They've used the same milk powder for a number of years. Its mix rate was 150 grams per litre. I compared it to Energizer.
Yeah.
Its mix rate's 135 grams.
So cheaper
per litre.
Cheaper per litre.
You sat down and worked it out to feed those calves to the same period. You were going to need to use 3 tonnes of Energizer compared to 3.5 tonnes of the competing product.
There's your £200.
Straight away, yes, the headline price was higher, but the overall cost for rearing those calves was going to be higher by using the alternative powder.
So I was on a farm yesterday and we were talking about rearing dairy crosses, and they'd been using a powder 150 grams in a litre. They weren't quite getting their growth rates that they wanted. I said, right, give me 3 months, try Energizer. I think we can get 2 weeks off your finishing time. If we can do that, we can make up the extra £300 tonne difference, and they're going to give it a go. It might not work because there's lots of things that affect it, but sometimes you've got to give something different a bit of a go. And the headline figure, and that's why you need to work with professionals like yourself, with reps, like ask the questions. There might be different ways of doing it, but the headline figure isn't always the...
No. But I try and say it's a lot to people. It's not just about the headline figure, it's about that return you're going to get on that. So there's a classic example. We needed half a tonne less milk powder, so it actually worked out cheaper to buy them more expensive powder.
I was going to say that's an Energizer price. That's going to be what, 1,800 quid, maybe half a tonne. So.
But your research, I could help you a lot if I could do genomic testing on the animals, because then I could get the group of animals that have got the best genetic potential and give them extra feed, and they'll definitely grow more.
That's where epigenetics and everything.
And that's where I do when I work with farmers. I do say, if you're trying to breed good genetics, you need to exploit. You can't really use that word, can you? Enhance genetic potential. You need to make sure you're expressing it, because if you give them 6 litres of a low quality milk replacer, that it's just not going to happen. And then genetics are pretty expensive, like milk's expensive. Make them work.
And the less you feed, because the less you need.
And the ratio, the return on investment for calves getting, fed properly, getting to the correct growth rates, getting to correct insemination rates. You're looking at a 3-to-1 return on investment generally if you feed them right.
I mean, it is.
But you have to think forward, and that I know from standing in calf sheds for a long time, it's hard to think forward sometimes, because you sat there and you think, but you do. And we, the calf rearers, we really are the beginning. We really are making.
Absolutely.
And we make the dairy cows or beef animals that they become.
Well, exactly, and it is. You've got to get it right in those first 2-3 months.
So important.
You've got to get it right. It has such an effect on the whole life of that animal, as to where she's going to go. And we're talking about efficiency again. Banging on that drum again. It's the most efficient time in that animal's life for feed conversion.
Which is just never repeated. It's never repeated.
We need to make it, and I mean the fact that, as you say, if you're, like you were mentioning, doing it right, you're keeping less of them, as you were saying. It'll lower your carbon footprint. It potentially lets them go on longer. It produces higher.
Gets your feed costs down from all these heifers that you're trying to keep.
Exactly. It all knocks on.
But the most important thing, we're going in towards sort of like extreme welfare and how we do things and longer lasting cows. And you say the first 2 weeks we call the immune, just building you. That is brilliant.
I just think if we thought about feeding for immunity and feeding for health, then we would think differently about how we feed them.
Okay,
and she's going to grow up like that. She's going to grow up healthy.
Throw it at you then in that case. Trouw has some competitors, obviously, that have a transition milk.
Oh yeah. Well, you mean a milk powder.
A milk powder.
We've not been able to replicate transition milk in a milk powder.
Okay, they call it their transition milk, but anyway, I can't remember what the exact name is. But
I do, but I'm not going to say it.
Yeah, I know, don't. But you have where they feed milk for the colostrum for those first few days. Yeah. Then you feed this as they call it, transition milk, whatever, for 10 days or whatever it is, and then on to a more traditional milk powder. What is your take on those? As you're talking about feeding for immunity, what is your take on that? Is it worth considering?
So earlier in this talk, we talked about colostrum being the first feed, and then subsequent milkings. Subsequent milkings is something called transition milk. This transition milk can't go in the tank. This transition milk has to be kept out. And the reason why it has to be kept out is because there's lots of hormones in there, lots of fats, lots of things that are really good for the calf. Have we been able to replicate that in calf milk replacer? No, we haven't. Trouw Nutrition do not have a transition milk in a bag as yet. So transition milk is a great substrate. Why do more farmers not feed transition milk? A million reasons, right? Yonis, bacteria, getting it from where the cows are milked to the calves. Bacteria replicates in whole milk, transition milk, every 20 minutes. So we've got to look after it. People forget that. So a transition milk available in a bag is a nice idea, but it's not available yet. What I think they're trying to do is what we just talked about with regards to protecting that first couple of weeks. Feed a really high spec milk replacer like Energizer. I'll use my own brand rather than talking about others, and then wean down on a slightly cheaper powder to try and protect that initial first period, so that feeding for immunity. But yes, the idea that we can replicate transition milk does not exist.
I should say, obviously that that particular parenting is a damn sight more expensive than Energizer, so I guess you're balancing it by using cheap powder. But I would say, and I've always been told, we've always said it, calves like consistency. You're chopping and changing powders all the time.
They don't like a change of powder. They like consistency, and I think.
So why not feed? I would say why not feed a quality powder?
Yeah.
All the way through.
Well, yeah, and all the things we've talked about means that it feels like a no-brainer, but I do understand why farmers balk at prices because, well, especially during COVID, prices are a bit more stable now, but we've had some shocking prices on skim, haven't we? And I get why they think, oh, God, it's a big ask, and that's why I think the idea on feeding a transition milk for all the goodies is great, but yeah, the science isn't quite there yet. Maybe it'll come, maybe it won't. But for me, I agree with you. Feed a good quality milk replacer all the way through. Feed as much as you can afford to do. So like I say, a minimum of 8 litres for really. I did hear a nice presentation at the early start of the year talking about only feeding 6 litres to replacement dairy heifers. There was an interesting talk because the spec of the milk replacer that needs to be fed to calves when you're only feeding 6 litres does not exist in the UK. So it's pretty hard to get a hold of that here. So it's an interesting concept.
What was the spec?
So it needed to be 25% fat, which we've got in Energizer, but it was recommended at 25% protein. That doesn't exist. No. So it was interesting to hear the litres, whereas I think that feed as much as you want to, manage the feed curve on the way down, allow them to drink to appetite. We also spoke at the beginning about calves being in pens together. That's something that happens to help calves feel like calves, to alleviate stress. If we allow calves to drink more milk, they're going to feel less stressed because when they're with mum, they expect to drink, 10 to 15 litres? And then we say one day to them, oh, here you go, here's 6. Go on, have fun. There's going to be some issues there with stereotypical behaviours. So I'm talking about chewing bars, chewing navels, chewing each other. Oh, that's all that's saying is I'm really hungry and I need to satisfy.
And that's why they're sucking other calves.
Why do you think of food at that stage?
Why do you give babies bottles? What's the reason for giving a baby a bottle? Because it replicates a nipple. Because it helps them express what they want to do.
Why do you give them a dummy?
A dummy, yeah.
Yeah, that's a better example.
Keep them quiet.
But also, it allows them to have a suck reflex, doesn't
That's
it?
Exactly right.
And that's what calves want to do. So
it's a soothing thing, isn't it? That suckling is a soothing mechanism.
So if you give them more milk, so if you go from say 6 to 8 litres, you're going to help calves feel like they're performing natural behaviours a little bit more.
And they're happier, which is what we're trying to say.
They're more content. I try not to use the word happy because people get upset when I use that. But they're more content, and if they're more content, they're more likely to grow. Immune systems are more likely to become more robust, and you will get that 0.8 to a kilo of daily live weight gain that you're striving for.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a lot though, isn't it? It's a lot to take in.
Well, there's a huge amount, and I guess I'm fortunate. A lot of what you said I sort of know anyway, but the whole point is this podcast is to help other people think about what they're doing, and if it can improve what they're doing, then but it still makes you think about it. And I guess again you're putting it in a different way and making think from some other points of view, not thought about it in.
I try and keep it simple. I know I'm talking about osmolality and hyperemia and things like that, but I try and keep it as when the calf comes out of mum, what's she expecting? Yeah. And then work back from that. And if you can try and minimise stress, and we don't fully understand stress. I spent my PhD trying to understand stress in dairy cows. It's pretty difficult. Every individual expresses it differently. Right. Calves are going to be no different. But we need to try and minimise that, because what we're trying to do, we're trying to build an immune system. Sorry, this is repetitive. Build organs, build the dairy cow or the beef animal that's supposed to become. You got one shot.
Yeah.
But it's the basics, really. I know you're saying it's repetitive, but it is the basics. It still comes down to, again,
and
efficiency, and that's the best time to make them do it, and we've got to make the most of it then.
I know we've got a placement student at Trouw at the minute, and she came and watched me do a couple of talks to farmers, and after one of the talks she said, "It's not rocket science though, is it?" And I was like, slightly offended, but then not. I was like, well, no, but we just need reminding. I needed reminding as a calf rearer. Sometimes you just need someone to say, why are you doing that? Like, let's do it differently. And it's just, there's so many conflicting messages, and I do feel for all your listeners. Lots of milk powder companies, lots of electrolyte companies, and vet companies are trying to sort of talk about different messages, but let's think about what the calf's expecting, and let's work back from there.
Well, it comes down, I was thinking about what, like, when we had Colin talking about the silage additive, and he was sort of saying, back in the day, or it would have been when it was old ICI, stick a bit more nitram or whatever it was, and eggs it's not growing, but it's not necessarily the best advice, is it? It's trying to sift through it all and find the best advice to get, whether it's the best grass growth or the best calf growth or whatever it happens to be.
I think although it's absolutely correct, it's not rocket science, but one of the things you often have to do is actually, when you're looking at why you're doing something, is to actually understand the science behind it. And that's why we actually need to actually redo it. Okay, we're doing it this, and this is why. And this is what our research has now shown us.
Yes.
Now we've got to the next step.
I can't emphasise how much we've learned about calf rearing and calf feeding in the past 20 years, 20, 30 years. When I first started feeding calves, and this is put lightly, it was 2 litres of dump milk after first milking, and that's all I got. And the buggers survived because they're really feed efficient. But now I look back and I head in my hands, but actually now I'm out doing this job, I would be a much better rearer now than I was 4 years ago, because I've learned so much. But we just learn with every step, and I think it's...
Yeah, you're right, Nick. My knowledge has improved a hell of a lot this side compared to where I was, and you think, what did we do that for? Or it just, that's what it was.
As nutritionists, you need to be interested in the beginning because you've got to ration that future generation, and if they're not getting a good start...
Oh, don't get me started, because there are a lot out there, I think, are really interested in cows.
I know.
And from a genetic point of view, I'm extremely interested in that baby.
Yeah, of course you are.
Start of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it's probably getting time to pull this to a close. So, I mean, any last words of wisdom from you, Laura?
Oh gosh, the question that I always get asked is, what's the best calf system out there? And my reply is always one met with size. It's not the system, it's the people. Unfortunately, I've been to some places that are not designated calf units have the best calves. I go to places that are designated calf units, and it's
seen the same.
Not great. So for me, it's the people. The next question, what's the best milk replacer? Oh, that's completely dependent on so many factors. So you can never recommend one, but digestibility is key. Dairy products, dairy protein, that's what you need for digestibility. Ask your reps questions. If they don't know, that's telling you enough.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any thoughts?
That was very good. Thanks. I've enjoyed this thoroughly.
No, it's we always enjoy it. I mean, I've got a social media this morning that out for another day of podcasting to learn and to have a laugh along the way, and that's what we always do. What I should say is, like usual, follow us on Twitter at ChewintheCud Pod. We're obviously also on other social media as well. Or if you've got any questions for Laura or any of our podcast guests, then please do contact us at podcast@chewinthecud.com. Remember, no G. And what I also should say is, this is now a year we've been doing this, Neil. I mean, no, in fact, this is, I can't believe.
That needs a little clap, I think, for a year.
I mean, was it May last year or something? We started messing around with the idea and had the few, but in terms of the proper ones, our first one was July last year, so this is now our year anniversary, which is why I am going to, for those that have managed to listen to the end, I'm going to say the first 5 people that email us, doesn't matter where you are in the world, I will send you a Chewing the Cud podcast hat as a celebration for our first year, because I know we've got listeners around the world and regulars good obviously here in the UK as well, but it would just be lovely to say a thank you to some of those. So the first 5 people, once this goes out, to email at podcast@chewinthecud.com. I'm going to send out a Chewing the Cud podcast hat. I better get Neil one as well, because he hasn't got one yet. But yes, no, I will. I just think the fact we've been doing this a year, and we obviously got our intentions to go forward and do more, is fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for the support out there.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I love watching the figures to see where people are listening to us from. So no, that's fantastic. So on that case, thank you, Laura. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I loved it. Thank you.
Hopefully it's going to make some people think about their milk powder, which is what the whole point of why we do this, is to make people think about what they're doing. And yeah, so obviously in that case, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Neil, and we'll speak again soon. So thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
And now for the really boring bit, I'm afraid, the legal disclaimer. The information provided during this podcast has been prepared for general information purposes only and does not constitute advice. The information must not be relied upon for any purpose, and no representation or warranty is given to its accuracy, completeness or otherwise. Any reference to other organisations, businesses or products during this podcast are not endorsements or recommendations of Chewing the Cud Limited. The views of Andrew Jones are personal and may not be the views of Chewing the Cud Limited, and the views of Neil Greggor are personal and may not be the views of Master Gen Limited and any affiliated companies. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.